The gaming industry is cooked. We're expecting a crash at any moment. It's all very doom and gloom for the gaming industry. At least that's what I've been hearing in the news recently, as far as one of my favorite hobbies, one of my favorite pastimes ever since I was a child. And that's gaming, playing video games. And sure, I'm reaching that point in my life, that age bracket, where I just can't really devote that amount of time to every single game that comes out recently. And when I start to get the downpour of like reviews and critiques about how some of these recent games are just not hitting, we have to turn back to the old faithfuls, to the past generations that showed us what true gaming was really all about. And so a lot of people have been kind of commenting and almost kind of calling back and kind of digging up their old titles from like the 360 and PlayStation 3 days to get some really good video game vibes going compared to what's the current slop that's kind of plaguing the industry right now. And that actually kind of jumpstarted a little bit of my brain into thinking about my recent playthrough of Batman Arkham Asylum for a 15-year retrospective that I did last year. And how I enjoyed going through that game once more, only this time with a very clean 60 frames per second sort of coat of paint through PC. Finally getting it to play on this specific platform as opposed to console, especially since I was very hesitant to want to jump back into the console version because that Return to Arkham iteration, in my opinion, is not the definitive version. The remaster, something about the lighting, something about the way that the characters are shaded, it just doesn't click with me. And that kind of brought forth another thought. I think it's maybe time to revisit Batman Arkham City on PC with, again, that cleaner aesthetic with 60 frames per second smooth mostly throughout, and also so I can get it out of the way before we get to that eventual 10-year anniversary of Batman Arkham Knight. Yes, I feel old as well. But it's going to be a very awkward video to make because I'm probably going to have one of the most hot takes. This can probably be as the hottest gaming take I have documented in video, but it's because of how hot that it is that I feel compelled all the more to make a video of it, to really tackle these notions that I had years back and see whether or not they have changed. The notions of actually preferring Batman Arkham Asylum over Batman Arkham City in a world where most people prefer the latter as being one of the best sequels ever made. Is it truly worthy of that title? Did Batman Arkham City age just as well as Asylum? Or am I going to stick with my convictions in believing that Arkham Asylum is simply just a better Batman game than Arkham City? First, let's tackle why it is that I hold Arkham Asylum in such high regard. And I don't want to really go through every single bullet point that I covered in that original video. If you guys want to check out my 15-year retrospective video on Arkham Asylum that I posted on the channel last year, you guys can do so by simply either waiting until the end of this video to click on that little annotation that shows up, that little end screen element, or you can simply just search it up on my channel. It is there. But to kind of recap just a teensy bit of what I really covered on that channel and why, in my opinion, Arkham Asylum is not only one of the best Batman games, but one of the best superhero action games, and why I prefer it over City, is because of the fact that they were able to hit it out of the park on their first go around. Sure, there's an awful lot of implementations within Arkham City that they built upon, but there's got to be a foundation, a canvas to really stack those bricks on top of that fundamental blueprint that is the gameplay. And the fact that, in my opinion, I know a lot of people might not necessarily feel the same way, but it's the fact that Asylum takes place on Arkham Island and it feels just so claustrophobic, I think just adds to the focus, it adds to the tension, and in my opinion, it just kind of builds on this faithful take on the characters that we already kind of had, especially bringing in writers from the animated series, but also people that are in the know with the comics to kind of give us this perfect blend of a darker tone while at the same time still remaining faithful to something that could be lifted from the comics, lifted from the animated series, kind of have that pulpy feel and still feel very much at home with Batman lore, all taking place on this one island. And because of it being on an island and taking place over one night, it feels like everything is just spiraling out of control outside of Batman's control in a very boilerplate sort of style that to me just resonates a little bit better, and that's what I absolutely adored about Arkham Asylum. And as you navigate the island, you're of course then imbued with the power that truly makes you feel like Batman, like all those memes from that one IGN review from, of course, the cook Greg Miller. Anyways, that's a whole nother tangent. But unfortunately, credit where credit is due, those pillars that make up the Batman gameplay have still aged like a fine wine out of Arkham Asylum, as far as the combat, as far as the controls, no matter how tanky Batman can kind of feel from time to time, especially when you activate any of the sprinting options. It is, after all, the beefcake that is Batman. He's not meant to be a much more agile counterpart like Nightwing or any of his Robin sidekicks. Or over on the Marvel side, my other favorite superhero, Spider-Man. He's not meant to be like that. So he's supposed to be a little bit on the tankier side, but when you deliver the punches where they count and you're able to counter using the little triangle mechanic, or at least the top face button mechanic, and be able to get into this constant flow and rhythm of the combat, flying from one section of the room to the next, it's just so euphoric to feel Batman kicking all these kinds of ass or taking them out from the shadows in the very Predator style of stealth approach to the gameplay. Activating detective mode, sure, a little overly reliant on it from time to time, and something that I tried to kind of restrain myself as I played it on Arkham Asylum on PC, but everything, all the components were still gelled there with an awful lot of attention to detail and care. And despite taking place on an island, you still felt like you were being rewarded for exploring certain avenues of the island that I think maybe you missed the first go around. There were plenty of sections when I was playing this game last year on PC for that retrospective that I discovered and never really noticed in my initial playthroughs, either back in 2010-ish, 2011-ish, when I finally got my PlayStation 3 Slim, and then a little bit in between on PlayStation 4 when I was during my streaming days when I was playing that very unfavorable Return to Arkham remaster on PlayStation 4, that double pack. And as time went on, I just kept kind of discovering something new. The exploration was being rewarded while at the same time being a love letter to classic Batman lore, extrapolated from the comics, from the animated series, characters that were born from the animated series like Harley Quinn. And all of this being able to be achieved in 2009 is just an absolutely amazing feat. So it was really perplexing, I think, for audiences back in 2010, 2011 when the game was initially revealed. And I think it's still something that people are trying to bottle in their heads of how it was possible for Rocksteady to deliver a sequel just 2 years later. And much like with Arkham Asylum, I have played Arkham City before, at least twice before, so this current playthrough for this specific video was done, I think, on my third go-around, my first being back in 2012 when I got the Game of the Year edition for PlayStation 3, and then once again during my streaming days back in like 2015, 2016, maybe 2017, when I played it in that Return to Arkham double pack. So bringing it up on PC, I was expecting a very smooth 60 FPS per second performance as far as the gameplay, much cleaner visuals. Of course, being a 2011 game meant that I didn't really have terrible amount of control as far as like the resolution. You can kind of activate it through like the Steam OS with that little window in terms of the management, but in-game you can only really control so much as far as like the brightness, the audio, things like that, which is a bit of a shame discovering that the cinematics are still stuck at 30 frames per second even on PC. I feel like that's something that I think we should probably be patching in through at this point. It's a little disappointing, but at least I'm glad to see that as soon as gameplay kickstarted, it did kind of revert to the much higher 60 FPS. Again, cleaner textures, much smoother visuals. Everything felt very cohesive with one another as far as the gameplay is concerned. And it's actually during this opening segment that, beyond those technical things that I was able to pick apart, I also kind of found myself very intrigued by how against type the opening segment of this game is versus the others, by subverting your expectations completely and having you play as Catwoman and getting an experience, a little taste of how it's like to play as Catwoman. She's much quicker. Sure, she's going to be a little bit on the weaker side with lesser health, but at the same time, it makes sense that you're able to deliver punches at a much more rapid pace than you are as the tankier Batman. So I thought that was pretty cool, but at the same time, something that I think I still feel from time to time now versus before was still feeling like the pacing of the game is a little interrupted by these Catwoman segments. It was a really cool, neat way to open the game, but later on there are times where it does feel a little bit like cliffhangery, like you're watching a show and then all of a sudden an episode ends on a cliffhanger, only to then discover the next episode is going to be a bottle episode for another character. So you're going to have to wait 2 weeks to exactly know what's going on. And from time to time, that was a little cumbersome. But at least here, it is then swapped out for yet another very interesting decision, which is to open the game not as Batman, but as Bruce Wayne. Unlike Arkham Asylum, you actually get your first-hand look in-game, because before you did have like some artwork that you were able to kind of access on the side on Asylum, but here you actually get to witness firsthand what Bruce does to kind of keep up appearances as the philanthropist billionaire Bruce Wayne, where he even kind of mocks Vicky Vale about calling him a millionaire, and he's like, billionaire. Millionaire so last year. He was doing his little flamboyancy with that. So I was very, very tickled by the fact that Kevin Conroy was able to play with that a little bit more, just like he did with the animated series, where he has to act a little oblivious to certain things to keep up appearances. So you get a little bit more of that here, while at the same time delivering a very failed attempt to shut down Arkham City, only to realize that this was part of his plan all along. And during this segment, you get the credits, you get a very well-made impression of the scope of Arkham City, about the fact that you're no longer on an island, but also at the same time not a full-blown city. I do appreciate a little bit much more fondly here that back in the day I thought to myself, I don't like Arkham City's approach to an open world versus the claustrophobic Arkham Island. That's what I prefer, Arkham Asylum's island versus the city in city. But playing it now on PC and kind of getting a new, fresher viewpoint this time around, I did feel like I could appreciate the fact that they didn't blow their load too early, to be a little bit explicit in my analogies here, because it truly is just a segmented version of Gotham City that is then dubbed Arkham City as a maximum super prison. So I definitely understood the assignment from the developers that they wanted to save Gotham City for their epic finale and not give you the full load just yet. And I did get a sense of that with the map and with the scale and the scope that you were treated to when you're walking through those halls as Bruce Wayne, and eventually you break free, get your suit from Alfred, and are finally unleashed to then take down Protocol 10 and figure out what the hell is going on. And naturally, during this opening segment, even as Bruce Wayne, but also with a little bit more bleeding on to when you finally put on the suit, you then get your tutorials of how to do combat, or at least a bit of a refresher of what you remember from Arkham Asylum. And here you get your taste of those pillars: the detective mode, /stealth, /predator as the game likes to call it, the combat, and then of course the detective work, as far as activating detective mode, being able to scan your surroundings, being able to gather as much information as possible, so that you can then fill in your role as the world's greatest detective. And during these pillars and during these tutorials, you definitely get a sense of having that fundamental blueprint that I was talking about and that I was loving from Arkham Asylum. And I'm very grateful that even after all of these years, even after my initial playthrough, the one thing that I can definitely not deny is the developers knowing that the game was just so well done that they didn't feel the need to fix something that wasn't essentially broken. And they simply just built upon that blueprint to give you more, to kind of develop more animations for certain punching styles. But the actual core combat is still the same, as far as punching with the left face button, countering with the top one, being able to kind of disarm with the right face button, in my case the circle, and then of course X to be able to jump, or being able to sprint by holding it down, while at the same time activating certain gadgets with the bumpers and the triggers, and being able to also like crouch, sneak around, activate detective mode. You guys know the deal. If you're watching this, you pretty much have played the Arkham series as much as I have. And again, I enjoy the fact that they were able to still build upon that blueprint by gathering more animations, different styles to his combat, as far as punching in a different way that he did in Arkham Asylum, being able to leap across certain enemies. And then some of those enemies also are escalating in their efforts, from being able to scan gargoyles and destroy them just like in the first game, but at the same time being able to drop a pellet, being able to build the smoke. And then vice versa, sometimes your detective mode is probably not as OP, as we say in the gaming sphere, as it was in the first game, because there are times where I'm thinking to myself, why is the detective mode not showing me a body that I'm trying to find within Arkham City? And from time to time, those frustrations, those little grievances will kind of rear their head in a very 7th gen 2011 sort of style. There's a couple of side quests that now being in my 30s and knowing that one of my most anticipated games of the year is coming up, Doom the Dark Ages, I thought to myself, I gotta wrap this up quickly. So I had to look up specific little locations of a particular victim's body that my detective mode was strangely not picking up, only to then realize that it truly was being hampered by some unknown element, some variable that I couldn't deduce. For some reason, I was behind a building, couldn't see the body, but finally going through a wall, going over a wall and over a roof, I can finally see the body from down below, and I'm like, that feels a little arbitrary. So maybe that could have been a little bit, that felt like putting down the detective mode and then trying to come up with an explanation, but the developers were just like, well, because you had it too easy in the first game. And I'm like, yeah, but over here, there's not an in-game, in-universe explanation as to why my detective mode wasn't working. And that also led me to an awful lot of other moments that I also remember having in Arkham Asylum, where I could have sworn I hit the counter button, and for some reason, Batman just has like this delayed reaction, and this is Batman we're talking about, and for some reason the enemy was still able to get a punch in and ruin my combo. But minus those little mild frustrations, the gameplay is still, as the kids like to say these days, peak, especially as you navigate through the story and gain more upgrades very natively in that story as opposed to just calling it in. Because one of the things that I kind of criticized Arkham Asylum after replaying it for that retrospective was that certain gadgets I think should have been on his belt already, going into such a dangerous place like Arkham Asylum. And here, I'm able to kind of excuse it a little bit more because he was meant to go in there as Bruce Wayne to just do like this campaign. He wasn't, the chances of needing all of these things are a little bit more lenient because he probably had to leave some things behind because he wasn't going to be able to change right away. It wasn't like he just arrested the Joker. He was dressed up as Bruce Wayne and he called on Alfred to be like, hey, send in my suit. And there was only so much that he could put in that capsule. So I was able to excuse it a little bit more. But certain gadgets like the zipline I think should be in there by default. So I'm still nitpicking that from time to time. But some of the upgrades that weren't present in Arkham Asylum and you get here are badass, are awesome. Again, a buildup of what was established before. And I like the fact that some of them are included in much more, like I said, very lived-in way, whether it be an inmate finding or some kind of secondary character within Arkham City bringing it to you, such as Robin via Alfred's request, or having a police officer discovering it in the museum and being like, hey, what is this? Some of which are even optional, that you might not even across them ever. And I remember there's certain ones that I didn't even come across during my initial playthroughs back in the day, and only now in my third one that I finally find the little freezer grenade upgrade that I never encountered before. Though at times it did feel a little strange to play through some of these areas, and again, being a much older gamer, it's almost like discovering that Santa Claus is not real because there's certain sections that I thought to myself, what would it be like if I tried to game over this section? And at times I would get the iconic Arkham game over screens. But then there's other times during certain QTE sections where I couldn't really fail, or I only pressed the button once and it auto succeeded. Or other times where I thought to myself, nothing really matters here, like fighting Joker. And for some reason, I was trying to like see exactly what he did, but in reality, I have no option but to just deliver the punches and see what happens. And I guess that's also a really good segue as to some of the things that I personally didn't think hold too well like the gameplay does, because again, I can't reiterate how amazing the gameplay is, but I think that's only what's going to showcase the few areas where I start to kind of divert into my own path of being in the minority. Some of the things that I personally don't think aged as well, or I think don't really compare too well to Arkham Asylum. One of which would have to be the UI. Yeah, it's kind of strange how, to this day, I still kind of wince at the way that everything's kind of stacked, specifically the upgrade tree. I personally prefer the upgrade tree on the original. I liked not only the stencil, comic booky sort of illustrations for the designs of the upgrades, but at the same time, I like that it's kind of stacked at the bottom to show it on a horizontal level, but not on the vertical level, to show you the progression of getting something and then getting the better version of that something. And it also kind of, I guess it kind of plays a little bit into my biases because it also reminds me of also one of my other favorite superhero games, Spider-Man 2, the movie, the game, that showed an upgrade tree in a very similar design. Whereas the upgrade tree for Arkham City, I just don't like the whole grid pattern that to me, it just kind of made things a little bit confusing to navigate, to where I'm like, did I get that upgrade already? Oh, I have to look into those dashes to know that I upgraded it an extra time, or gained an extra health bar, or I'm a little bit more impervious to bullets, or did I get that one like bat claw upgrade that I can shoot out like multiple claws at the same time? Oh, that's not here? I thought it was sandwiched in there, and kind of having to press the triggers to navigate to a different section that was part of the Predator bracket, and then navigating to the Catwoman section. I'm like, I feel like this is probably the only thing that I felt was a little sped through to make sure that this game met its 2011 release date. I think this was probably the only sacrificial lambs where they were focused on the gameplay, and that's good, but they probably had to look at something and go, what can we just expedite as quickly as possible in a much more consolidated way? And I think it was the UI. And it's in this UI where I couldn't really find any way to get the grapple upgrade, considering that the tanky controls are again back here, and they make sense for the character of Batman, but being that we're in a much more open environment as opposed to how we were on Arkham Asylum, the traversal felt just a little bit more tedious here, because obviously you're going to have different objectives on almost opposite sides of the map at certain points, and trying to navigate across these rooftops, ziplining, but then running in that tankier style. I don't know what it is, but this was definitely a solution that I will give credit over to Arkham Knight for fixing. And yes, I understand that there is technically a grapple upgrade, but unfortunately, and this is mostly my dumbass not realizing this, that in order to get this upgrade, you need to go through the entire AR training program that's part of a side quest. And this whole time, I thought that that was a side quest that I personally didn't feel needed too much priority. And because of that, I left it until literally the end of the game. So I was struggling to traverse the map for literally like hours, almost a dozen hours, and finally towards the end I was like, let me do that AR stuff before I wrap things up and roll credits. And it was finally at the end of the 4 missions they were like, hey, here's the grapple improvement that lets you zip as soon as you get to the roof and fly off into a glide, kind of like in Arkham Knight, which was default in Arkham Knight. And I'm like, yeah, this would have been really great, really beneficial and really helpful like 5 or 6 hours ago. But I'm able to navigate through all these like little quirks and frustrations in a much more favorable light, especially after playing it in PC with the 60 FPS. I felt a little bit more in tune with how Batman controlled within this environment. I knew what to really expect, but I gotta be honest, there's one thing that I think to this day, even after playing the game 3 times, even after rolling credits on PC with a modern sensibility, with this new, lenses, now being in my mid-30s, it's probably, again, leading to what could be considered as one of the more hotter takes that I'll have as a gamer. And that is that I don't think that Arkham City's story is as strong as that of Asylum's.
Shut up!
Don't get it twisted. It's not necessarily a bad plot. It still feels very much at home with something that you would expect out of a Batman comic or out of a Batman animated series. Some sort of through line that feels lifted from the Dark Knight's adventures. But ultimately, I feel like even now, going through the story and thinking to myself, am I missing something? Was there something that just didn't click with me back in like 2012 when I played on PS3, or when I replayed it with the Twitch audience, etc., that just maybe detracted or was really distracting me from getting the main focus, the main message? And ultimately, I still think that it feels like a bit of a MacGuffin chase. If you guys are familiar with the term MacGuffin, where it's like this one thing that needs to be grabbed. And I feel like it still feels like we're chasing some kind of MacGuffin as Batman and going through this wild goose chase to then excuse appearances by certain Batman Rogues Gallery villains that didn't make the cut in Arkham Asylum. Characters that were probably referenced to some capacity, but now they're getting their time in the sun to shine, such as Ra's al Ghul, the Penguin, of course, I already mentioned Catwoman, but finally getting our first-hand look at Two-Face, etc. And I'll still give him credit for being able to show a little bit of restraint in making these more than just egregious cameos. You actually do feel like these are villains that make sense to be kind of unleashed into the super prison that is Arkham City, so it makes sense for them to be there. It's just the way that Batman kind of comes across them as like a bit of a, almost like a Batman-themed roller coaster to me. And even though it's still done in, like I said, as much of an eloquent way as humanly possible, or as creative as possible, I should say, I still feel like it's simply just the ride that we're going along with Batman, and not as, like I said, focused or not as boilerplot-ish as Arkham Asylum was, where it makes sense to not have all these villains together in the one section of the island, considering that they could probably team up, whereas within Arkham City, it just feels like, okay, why was Two-Face going after Catwoman? I mean, I know that there's probably some textbook reason, but at the same time, he's doing it because he's trying to show superiority. Like, hey, I took out the Catwoman. I'm like, well, then why did you go for Catwoman? Why didn't you try to do something for Batman? And yes, this even includes how it is that Batman gets entangled with the Joker. Ever so often, I still think to myself, yeah, Batman is ultimately trying to figure out what Protocol 10 is and how Hugo Strange is involved and how to stop it, considering that it's probably a very bad thing that's going to happen within Arkham City. Why is it that his first intuition was to go to the Joker and to see if he knows, knowing that that could probably lead him into a trap? I gotta be honest, that's the one thing that I still have some question. I don't definitively think it's like a terrible point of the story, but I still have like questions. I'm still questioning it. And the fact that all these years later, I'm still asking questions about it means that I don't think it has aged as refined as the actual unfolding of the plot as Arkham Asylum's did, despite ending in a very cookie cutter, very generic boss fight in the form of Titan Joker. But at the same time, that's something that feeds into the gameplay and not so much the story. It makes sense within the story and within the convictions of the Joker to shoot himself up with the Titan to take on Batman in a much more unorthodox way that he's used to. So here, I do, however, like that the story, despite, again, being in the minority of not favoring it as much as that of Asylum's, at least it's this interwoven plot of, like I said, going on tangents with villains and with characters off onto the side, having these superhero cameos in the form of, like I said, Robin literally showing up to be like, hey, here's your gadget, I'm out. It's I like that stuff to me. I don't know. I tried to get into it as hard as I could, but I couldn't. But at least the one thing that didn't completely lose me was knowing that this plot, this story, this interwoven sort of style to the writing did at least hold characters that since then have in fact aged like fine wine. Batman and the Joker, played by Kevin Conroy and Mark Hamill, they are still amazing. They are still in top form. In my opinion, this is one of the more definitive takes on either of those characters, and that's still considering the animated series. I feel like there's something just different enough of how they play these characters here than they do in the animated series that I'm like, I still feel like they're kind of different, and I still hold them in very separate but equally as good regards. And the writing for the specific individual characters is still top notch. They still feel like the characters that you know and love and makes sense for their lore, it makes sense for their background, for why it is that they're in Arkham City. Like I said, the way that Two-Face talks in terms of like the court and the justice system, Joker, the way that he's written, Batman, the way that he's written, even Robin, whenever certain characters like Robin feel a little inconsequential to the plot, I still enjoy the way that they kind of talk and banter to the characters that practically made him, the way that Robin asks questions about Batman and whether or not he's okay, and of course Batman being trying to keep things as close to the chest as much as possible and as reserved as possible makes sense for the brooding character that he is. And regardless of whether or not I like the closeness of Arkham Asylum to the openness of Arkham City, it's at least draped in the art style and direction that I still absolutely adore about these Arkham games, predominantly in Arkham Asylum and City, because they go for, like I said, this aesthetic that feels kind of like comic booky animated series, while at the same time having a darker tone, going for something a little grimier feeling, and striking that perfect balance that, again, still is one of my favorites. And that bleeding over to the character designs, the way Catwoman is designed, Two-Face, Ra's al Ghul, and some of the other side characters, some of which you may or may not even come across, but thankfully I did this time around, like Hush. They look badass, and they look quintessential archetypes for action figures that I would love to own, some of which I actually do have in my shelf right up there. And they all still have this cohesive tone to, again, the prior Arkham game, while at the same time striking its own identity that still feels like it can kind of appeal to everybody, whether it be kids who are growing up in Batman currently, or people who loved Batman before, and they want to experience something that's, like I said, a very nice sandwich in between, without going too far on the darker tone. see Arkham Knight later on for those details. At the time, not so much now, but at the time, you can tell that Rocksteady was a developer that catered to those little details as far as giving everything the attention, the love, and the care that it deserves, as far as the damage that Batman sustains on his suit, as well as all of the other little Easter eggs and background information that doesn't spell everything out for you and doesn't talk to you like a little kid like some of these modern games like to do these days, and stuff that lets you discover it for yourself. I already knew some of these that I have encountered in prior playthroughs, such as the pregnancy test that Harley has been doing, Bruce's parents outline in that alleyway, the countdown by Hugo Strange for Protocol 10, and kind of building on this like rising tension of what exactly Protocol 10 is really going to be, as well as the Mad Hatter side quest that, even though I've never been the huge fan of Mad Hatter as a villain, it at least led to one of the more nightmarish images that out of all the Arkham games still kind of creeps me out, which is that bunny mask on Batman with him with the ears and the teething, him going very Majora's Mask style. And then there's a couple of new ones here and there. I can't remember every single one off the bat that I discovered during this new playthrough on PC, but the one that definitely put a smile on my face, no pun intended, or maybe a pun intended, would have to be that cutscene that shows Joker giving a video message to Batman. However, he's looking a little too healthy despite the Titan infection. Only for, in this new playthrough, for me to finally pay attention and realize that if you pay close attention, you can actually hear the real Joker coughing and moving the camera from behind the camera holding it. You can hear him cough and kind of shake the lens a little bit.
Tell you what it's all about. Would you be happy?
And I was like, all right, I never actually noticed that before. And that's a nice little attention to detail that, again, you can only really discover if you're replaying the game and you're really paying attention to those little details. And speaking of the whole fake Joker twist that I think took everybody by surprise, except me. I'm not saying that I knew it was Clayface or anything like that. Back in the day, it was a very interesting twist, and I did like it. But I was never like really floored or blown away. Like some people were like, "Oh my God, this is like the best twist since BioShock," and I'm like, well, I mean, within the context of the comics, it makes sense, and I did think that it was cool. To me, I think what is even cooler is the fact that it gave Clayface his time to shine as both a villain, as both very essential for that twist to really work, because out of all the characters, Clayface is the one to be able to mimic Joker almost to a T, except if you're using detective vision, of course. And it also builds on one of the very significant aspects about the game, which is the boss fights. Clayface has the final say on the final boss fight for this game that is really cool, but also reminded me that some of these boss fights are in fact taken to a whole nother level. Of course, the highlights would have to be Mr. Freeze and Ra's al Ghul. Those two, in my opinion, are what do the kids like to say? Kino boss fights. To the point where one of them, the Ra's al Ghul one, was so cool that certain elements of it are even replicated in Arkham Origins. You know you're doing something right when that is happening. And sure, there's some that, in my opinion, didn't really age as well as before. Personally, not a big fan of the Solomon Grundy fight, not only because I'm not a huge fan of the villain, I never really found him intimidating or cool or appealing, but on top of that, it's just your generic take out the 3 generators, go punch them, and then rinse and repeat. But I think that the better boss fights outweighed the much weaker ones, and again, it culminated in one of the bolder choices that the game did apart from the boss fights, which is to actually kill off the Joker and actually stick with those convictions, at least for a little while, which is leading to this kind of bittersweet tone of the ending, having the Joker finally being defeated, but not necessarily in the way that Batman wanted him to be, thus leading to him leaving Arkham City in silence, and resonating in this very heavy tone that you were probably not accustomed to a Batman game being able to do. And I think it is still impactful, and one of the things that has aged quite well even after all these years for this game. HowLongToBeat.com has this game pegged at 11 hours or so for being able to beat the main story and maybe a little bit of the side content. I, according to Steam, poured 20 hours into this third playthrough on PC, and I think that should still be a testament to how much of a great game this still is. Regardless of whether I prefer Arkham Asylum's elements or not, this is still a quality game. It's in no way, shape, or form a bad game that has aged poorly. It is still amazing, and it was still put together by developers that cared over at Rocksteady. And then on top of that, you can tell are incredibly huge fans of Batman as a character, Batman as a legend, Batman as a mythology, and DC as a brand overall. Standards were kept all the way through from the core gameplay to the main story, regardless of, like I said, my preferences and some of the things that I think vary in quality and effectively in affinity towards me. But at the same time, even the side stuff that is just supplementary to the main game, whether it be, like I said, some of the side quests that were really intriguing to me, such as the Hush one, or some of the other ones that involve, like I said, some side characters, Deadshot taking out certain victims and kind of playing into the detective angle of Batman, while at the same time stuff that, sure, to this day has kind of been memed on, like the Riddler trophies, but I'm kind of surprised and a little disappointed that a lot of you like to meme on Riddler for the numeric amount of trophies that he has scattered throughout Arkham City, and yet no one gives Zsasz his shit for the amount of times that he won't stop calling. But there was always a form of a carrot at the end of the stick within that environment that still had me continue to play when I knew that I could have rolled the story much earlier on. And even jumping out of the game, you can also activate the challenge maps, being able to get high combos. That gameplay is still superb as far as the combat that enticed me to want to do that at least a couple of times for Batman, for Catwoman, and even get a sense of that gameplay for some of those sidekicks that I talked about before, whether it be with Robin or Nightwing. Personally, kind of preferred Robin and his style with the pole and being able to utilize his shield. He feels very vertical with the way that he's able to navigate the environment and take down enemies. As opposed to Nightwing, I felt like he was a little empty, a little hollow. I didn't really like him all too much. And that's very much a blessing in disguise, considering that Robin is your central character that you get to play as in the Harley Quinn's Revenge DLC, which I did replay for this PC playthrough. And even though I personally don't believe it aged as well, because you can beat it in like under an hour, and it feels a little bit on the padded side because eventually you do play as Batman again, doing a little bit of detective work. It at least highlights Robin's gameplay style, a little bit more of that voice acting, the way he ties into everything, and I think its core strength is showing the aftermath of Joker's death and how it affected Batman emotionally, to the point where he's tonally different, and that's saying a lot, considering how much, I don't want to say jovial, but he was willing to be a bit more open in the core game. So to give us a taste of how truly affected he was by Joker's death in Harley Quinn's Revenge, I think it's actually pretty neat. And that's ultimately what it's all about. Emotion, heart, and soul is at the center of Rocksteady's Arkham trilogy. And even within a inconsequential DLC like Harley Quinn's Revenge, or the main staples that is this series, from Arkham City to Arkham Knight, and then of course my personal favorite, Arkham Asylum, there was no one that was able to do it just as well as the developers at the time over at Rocksteady. And despite being one of the few that aren't completely in love with Arkham City as everyone else is and prefers Asylum, there was still this constant element of that attention to the heart and soul of what makes Batman Batman, and why it is that we love him and the characters and the villains that take part of his universe throughout all of the Arkham games, predominantly the trilogy that Rocksteady spearheaded and concluded in an effective manner with Arkham Knight, which I'm going to be tackling next for that 10th year anniversary, because that is essential to be done and to really showcase how great of a developer Rocksteady was going to become after the series was done. They couldn't possibly go into any other direction or anything that could potentially implode the company from within, right? Right?